The morning air inside the captured American tank smells of gun oil and leather. It's March 6, 1945, and Hauptmann Werner Holtz runs his hand along the 90mm gun breech, feeling the American manufacturing marks pressed into the steel. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls of this makeshift testing facility in Bavaria, the war is collapsing. Soviet armies are 40 miles from Berlin. American forces have crossed the Rhine. But here, in this moment, Holtz is discovering something that makes all of that seem somehow more inevitable, more final. The tank is an M26 Pershing, captured 2 weeks ago near Elsdorf, when a German counterattack overran an American position. The crew had set demolition charges, but they failed to detonate. Now it sits here, white star hastily painted over with German Balkenkreuz, ready for evaluation. Holtz has been testing German armor for 3 years. He knows every centimeter of a Panther's glacis plate, every technical specification of a Tiger's 88mm gun. He has written reports praising German engineering superiority, documenting the invincibility of the Panther tank. But as he settles into the gunner's seat of this American machine, something feels wrong. Not mechanically wrong, philosophically wrong. The question hanging in the cold March air isn't whether German armor can compete with this tank. The question is, how long has German armor supremacy been a comfortable lie? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what Holtz is about to discover, you need to understand what German tankers believed in 1945. Not what they knew. Belief and knowledge are different things in war. They believed, with the certainty of men who had survived 3 years of armored combat, that German tanks were the finest in the world. This wasn't propaganda. This was a lived experience. The Panther tank, introduced at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, represented a quantum leap in armored warfare. Its sloped frontal armor could deflect almost any Allied anti-tank round. Its 75mm Quev 42 gun could penetrate a Sherman tank from ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. American tankers called it the best tank of the war, even while fighting against it. British crews developed elaborate tactical doctrines built entirely around avoiding head-on engagements with Panthers. The numbers told the story. A single Panther could hold a defensive position against multiple Shermans. In Normandy, during the fighting around Caen, individual Panther crews recorded kills against 5, 6, 7 Shermans before being flanked or destroyed by air attack. This wasn't boasting. Allied after-action reports confirmed it. The exchange ratio was brutal. For every Panther destroyed, Allied forces lost an average of 3.7 tanks. German crews understood the mathematics of this superiority. They had seen it proven in the wheat fields of Normandy, in the forests of the Ardennes, across the frozen ground of the Eastern Front. When a Panther's gun sight centered on an enemy tank, that tank was already dead, it just didn't know it yet. The Panther's gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor from a mile away. The Sherman couldn't scratch the Panther's front plate from any practical combat range. This created a psychological dynamic that went beyond tactics. German tankers didn't just think they had better equipment, they knew it. Even as the Reich crumbled around them, even as fuel shortages and spare parts problems mounted, they clung to this technical superiority as proof that they could still win individual engagements. The war might be lost strategically, that was becoming undeniable by early 1945. But tactically, on the level of steel against steel, they were still superior. The Americans, meanwhile, had built their armored doctrine around a different philosophy entirely. The Sherman tank was never meant to fight other tanks. That was the job of specialized tank destroyers. Shermans were supposed to support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and overwhelm the enemy through numbers and mobility. It was a doctrine born of industrial reality. America could produce 5 Shermans in the time it took Germany to produce 1 Panther. But doctrine doesn't comfort the man sitting in a Sherman when a Panther appears on the horizon. American tank crews knew they were outgunned. They developed slang for it. Shermans were Ronsons after the cigarette lighter because they light up first time, every time. They were Tommy Cookers because of how easily they caught fire. Crews requested assignment to tank destroyers or self-propelled guns, anything but a Sherman. The casualty statistics reflected this technological gap. In armored engagements during 1944, American tank crews had a life expectancy measured in weeks once they encountered German heavy armor. Replacement crews arrived at the front barely trained, climbed into Shermans still warm from their predecessors' deaths, and died in their first or second engagement. Units kept running crew rotations, burning through men like ammunition. The British tried to solve this problem with the Sherman Firefly, a standard Sherman chassis mounting a 17-pound gun capable of penetrating a Panther's armor. It helped, but the Firefly was taller, more visible, and German crews learned to identify and target them first. By late 1944, Firefly crews had an even shorter life expectancy than standard Sherman crews. Inside the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, engineers watched this unfold with mounting horror. They had known since 1942 that American armor was inadequate for tank versus tank combat. The T-26 project, what would eventually become the M26, Pershing had been on the drawing boards since early in the war, but bureaucratic infighting, resource allocation debates, and doctrinal stubbornness kept delaying production. General Leslie McNair, commanding Army Ground Forces, insisted that the tank destroyer doctrine was sound. Tanks should support infantry. Tank destroyers should fight enemy armor. Building heavy tanks would waste resources better spent on more Shermans. He was wrong, but he had enough institutional power to slow the Pershing program to a crawl. The engineers built prototypes. They tested variants. They revised designs. And while they tested and revised, men died in Shermans. The first production, M26, Pershing didn't roll off the assembly line until November 1944. By then, the war in Europe had been raging for 5 years. The first 20 Pershings reached combat units in Europe in January 1945, just 20 tanks, issued to the 3rd Armoured Division for field testing. They performed well, better than well. They dominated the engagements they fought. A Pershing from the 3rd Armoured destroyed a German tank at 2,500 meters, a kill at ranges where Shermans were barely effective. Another Pershing engaged a Panther in the town of Elsdorf and knocked it out with a single shot through the frontal armor. It was this engagement, this brief, violent exchange in a German town, that inadvertently gave the Germans their captured Pershing. The American crew had pushed too far forward. German infantry surrounded the tank with Panzerfausts, the shoulder-fired rockets that had become the tanker's nightmare in urban combat. The crew bailed out. Demolition charges were set but failed to detonate properly. When German troops swept through hours later, they found the Pershing damaged but recoverable. Wehrmacht intelligence officers understood what they had. Rumors of a new American heavy tank had been circulating since late 1944. Photographic. Reconnaissance had captured blurry images. A few field reports mentioned them, but this was the first intact specimen. The tank was carefully transported to a testing facility in Bavaria. Repairs were made surprisingly straightforward, the mechanics noted. American engineering favored simplicity and ease of maintenance over the complex, over-engineered approach common in German designs. The Maybach engines in Panthers required specialist knowledge and careful adjustment. The Ford GAF engine in the Pershing was agricultural in comparison, rough, simple, almost crude, but it ran. Within a week, the Pershing was operational. Hauptmann Werner Holtz received orders to conduct a comprehensive evaluation, test its armor, test its gun, compare it directly against German equipment, find weaknesses the combat units could exploit. Holtz assembled his team carefully, veteran tankers who had served in multiple theaters, gunnery instructors from the Panzer schools, mechanical engineers who understood armor, metallurgy, and ballistics. They approached the task with professional curiosity mixed with a certain arrogance. This was, after all, an American tank. American tanks were numerous, reliable, adequate, but not superior. The Panther was superior. Everyone knew this. The first inspection began on the morning of March 6th. The Pershing sat in a warehouse converted for testing, surrounded by measuring equipment and technical instruments. Holtz walked around it slowly, notebook in hand, documenting first impressions. Armor thickness at the glacis plate? He called out to an engineer with calipers. 102 millimeters, sloped at 46 degrees from vertical. Holtz paused, recalculating the effective thickness in his head. When armor is sloped, its effective thickness increases dramatically. A 102 millimeter plate at 46 degrees would have an effective thickness of roughly 145 millimeters against horizontal fire. The Panther's upper glacis plate was 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees, effective thickness of approximately 140 millimeters. The American tank had thicker armor. He noted this without comment and continued the inspection. Armor was only half the equation. The Panther's gun was legendary, the 75 mm KK-42, with a barrel 70 calibers long, high velocity, exceptional penetration, the finest tank gun in the world. Holtz climbed into the Pershing's turret and examined the main armament. The gun breech bore American markings. 90 mm, gun M3, 90 mm, significantly larger bore than the Panther's 75 mm. But bore size alone didn't determine penetration. Velocity mattered more. A small shell moving very fast could penetrate more armor than a larger shell moving slowly. The Panther's gun achieved muzzle velocities around 925 meters per second. Exceptional performance. Holtz requested the technical data sheets recovered with the tank. American ammunition specifications. The 90 mm M82 armor-piercing round had a muzzle velocity of 853 meters per second, slightly slower than the Panther's gun, but the M82 shell weighed 10.9 kilograms. The Panther's armor-piercing round weighed 6.8 kilograms, 60% more mass. Physics didn't lie. A heavier projectile, even at slightly lower velocity, carried significantly more kinetic energy. Energy was what penetrated armor. The American gun was delivering substantially more energy on target than the Panther's gun. Holtz sat in the gunner's seat, thinking through the implications. Around him, his team continued their inspection, measuring turret thickness, examining the track links, documenting the suspension system. But Holtz was running calculations in his mind, comparing theoretical performance against his 3 years of combat experience. The next morning, they would begin live fire testing. They would shoot this American gun and see what it could actually do. They would shoot at this American armor and see what it could actually withstand. But already, sitting in that turret with his hand on the unfamiliar controls, Holtz felt the first crack forming in his certainty, the first whisper of doubt. What if German armor supremacy had been ending for months, and nobody had noticed? What if every engagement German crews had survived against these tanks had been luck rather than superiority? What if the war had been lost not just strategically, but technically? The testing will begin tomorrow. The answers would come quickly. And those answers would force Holtz and his team to confront a truth that German propaganda and German pride had worked desperately to conceal. The age of German armor invincibility was over. The Americans had built something better, and they had done it not through sophisticated complexity, but through brutal, practical effectiveness. The test range stretches across a flat expanse of Bavarian countryside, morning frost still clinging to the dead grass. March 7th, 1945. Holtz stands beside the Pershing, watching his crew prepare for the first live fire exercise. Downrange, at 1,000 meters, sits a captured Sherman tank battered, already damaged from previous tests, but still intact enough to serve as a target. The plan is methodical. Fire the Pershing's 90mm gun at various ranges. Document penetration, accuracy, effect on target. Then repeat the same tests with a Panther OS-FG, one of the newest models available. Compare the results. Find the weaknesses in the American design that German combat crews could exploit. Holtz climbs into the Pershing's turret, settling into the gunner's position. His loader, a veteran named Feldwebel Kurt Becker, who has served in Panzer IVs and Panthers since North Africa, loads the first M82 armor-piercing round. The breech closes with a solid metallic clunk. American engineering. Nothing elegant about it, just functional. Through the gun sight, Holtz centers the reticle on the Sherman's turret. The sight picture surprises him. It's clear, very clear. The Americans use a different optical system than German Zeiss optics. Simpler, fewer lens elements, but the light transmission is excellent. He can see the target perfectly despite the early morning haze. His hand finds the turret traverse control. In a Panther, turret traverse is manual unless the engine is running at high RPM to power the hydraulic system. It requires physical effort, especially when the turret is loaded with ammunition. But Pershing's turret rotates smoothly under his touch. Hydraulic power at all times. Effortless. The turret swings precisely to his command. Range, 1,000 meters, he calls out. Loaded, Becker confirms. Holtz takes a breath and squeezes the trigger. The gun roars. The recoil slams back against the mechanism, absorbed by the recoil buffer. Through the sight, Holtz watches the tracer arc downrange. Time seems to slow. The shell crosses 1,000 meters in roughly a second and a half. Impact. The Sherman's turret doesn't just penetrate. It erupts. The M82 shell punches clean through the frontal armor and detonates inside with catastrophic effect. Metal fragments blow out through every opening. The turret ring buckles. If there had been a crew inside, they would have been killed instantly, not injured, not wounded, but simply ceased to exist as recognizable human beings. Holtz sits back from the sight. Around him, the rest of the crew is silent. Load another round, he says quietly. They fire again. 800 meters. The shell punches through the Sherman's hull, entering through the sponson and exiting through the opposite side. They fire at 1,200 meters. Penetration, 1,500 meters. The shot strikes slightly off-center, but still penetrates with enough energy to cause catastrophic damage. 5 rounds fired, 5 devastating hits. The Sherman, already a tank that German crews considered inferior, has been reduced to scrap metal. But Shermans aren't what German tankers fear. Panthers are what American tankers fear. The test needs a proper baseline. They switch to the Panther OSF-G positioned nearby. Same drill. Same targets. Additional Sherman hulks have been placed downrange at various distances. Holtz climbs into the Panther's turret, a space he knows intimately. The smell is familiar: gun oil, spent propellant residue, the particular scent of German steel. The Panther's gun is magnificent. Holtz has always believed this. The long 75mm barrel, the precision Zeiss optics, the smooth action of a weapon designed by engineers who understood perfection. He centers the sight on a Sherman hull at 1,000 meters. Fire. The gun cracks. The shell strikes true. Penetration. The Panther performs exactly as expected, lethally effective against enemy armor. They fire multiple rounds at various ranges. Each shot confirms what Holtz already knows. The Panther is an exceptional tank, accurate, powerful, deadly. But something nags at him as he compares the two experiences. The Panther's manual turret traverse is slower, even with practiced crews. The hydraulic system in the Pershing gives American gunners a tangible advantage in target engagement speed. Seconds matter in combat. The tank that can fire first usually wins. The Panther's gun, while magnificent, doesn't produce the same devastating effect as the 90mm. The shells are lighter. They penetrate, certainly. But the sheer destructive power, the catastrophic damage that leaves no survivors, that seems to be an American advantage. Still, these are only offensive tests. Armor protection matters just as much as firepower. Perhaps Pershing's armor is its weakness. The afternoon brings the critical test: survivability. They position the Pershing hull down at 800 meters combat range, the distance where most tank engagements occur. Only the turret is visible above a low berm. A Panther OSF-G is positioned to fire at it. Holtz watches through binoculars as the Panther's crew prepares. The gun elevates slightly. A pause, then the sharp crack of the 75mm firing. Through the binoculars, Holtz sees the tracer streak toward the Pershing. The round strikes the curved gun mantlet, the thick armor protecting the gun mount. There's a shower of sparks, a flash of metal on metal. The shell bounces. It ricochets upward at an angle, tumbling into the sky. Again, Holtz orders into the field radio. The Panther fires a second round, this time aimed at the turret front, just below the gun. Another impact, another ricochet. The shell leaves a gouge in the armor but fails to penetrate. A third shot, carefully aimed at the junction between the turret and hull, often a weak point in tank design. The round strikes and deflects sideways. 3 rounds fired at 800 meters, 3 failures to penetrate. They reposition for a shot at the glacis plate, the sloped frontal hull armor. This is typically the strongest part of any tank, but it's also where most enemy fire is concentrated in combat. If the Pershing has a weakness, it might be here. The Panther fires. The armor-piercing round strikes the glacis at a shallow angle due to the slope. Physics takes over. The shell hits at roughly 30 degrees from perpendicular, encounters 102 millimeters of hardened steel sloped at 46 degrees. The effective thickness is more than the shell can defeat. It ricochets, spinning off into the dirt and leaving only a scar on the armor surface. Holtz lowers the binoculars. Around him, the other observers are quiet. One of the engineers, a man named Oberingenieur Franz Dietrich, who has been designing tank armor since 1941, speaks what there is of, all thinking. At combat ranges, the Panther cannot reliably penetrate the Pershing's frontal armor. The words hang in the cold March air like an accusation. Continue the test, Holtz says. Fire at the side armor. This is where every tank is vulnerable. Frontal armor is always heaviest. Side armor must be thinner to keep weight manageable. The Panther's side armor is 50 millimeters thin enough that almost any anti-tank weapon can penetrate. If the Pershing follows the same design philosophy, its sides will be vulnerable. The Panther repositions. Fires at the Pershing side hull from 800 meters. Penetration. Clean through. The round would have killed crew members and possibly detonated ammunition. A catastrophic kill. But Holtz knows the tactical reality. In combat, tanks try desperately to keep their frontal armor toward the enemy. Side shots are opportunistic flanking maneuvers, ambushes, mistakes. Most engagements happen front to front, and front to front, at combat ranges, the Panther cannot reliably kill the Pershing. Now comes the reverse test. The test Holtz is dreading. They position a Panther OSF-G hull down at the same 800 meters. Load the captured 90mm gun with an M82 armor-piercing round. Aim at the Panther's turret front. Fire. The 90mm roars. The shell crosses 800 meters and strikes the Panther's turret just to the right of the gun mantlet. The armor is 100 millimeters thick at that point, substantial protection by any standard. The shell penetrates. It punches through the armor, passes through the turret interior where the crew would be sitting, and exits through the rear turret plate. Holtz feels something cold settle in his chest. That was the turret front, supposed to be the Panther's strongest protection besides the glacis. Again, he orders. Aim at the glacis. The American gun fires a second time. The shell strikes the Panther's upper glacis plate 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees. The armor that has made the Panther legendary. The armor that has deflected British 17-pounders and Soviet 85mm guns. The American shell penetrates. It breaks through the slope, through the hardened steel, into the crew compartment. The hole is clean, catastrophic. Anyone sitting in the driver's or radio operator's position would be dead. They fire a third round at the side armor. The shell doesn't just penetrate, it over-penetrates, passing completely through the tank and exiting the opposite side. The energy transfer would have killed everyone inside and likely detonated the ammunition stored along the hull sides. Feldwebel Becker climbs out of the Pershing and walks to where Holtz is standing. He's been a tanker since 1941. He survived North Africa, Sicily, Normandy. He's seen Panthers destroyed before by air attack, by flanking fire, by mechanical breakdown. But this is different. Herr Hauptmann, he says quietly, that shouldn't be possible. The glacis penetration. I know. We've been telling crews the Panther's frontal armor is proof against anything the Americans can field. I know. We've been wrong. Holtz doesn't answer. Because Becker is right. They have been wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong in edge cases or unusual circumstances. Fundamentally wrong about the balance of armored combat. The testing continues over the next 2 days. They fire the 90mm gun at various German armor types. Panzer IVs are penetrated easily at all combat ranges. Panthers are vulnerable from the front beyond 800 meters and catastrophically vulnerable at closer ranges. They don't have a Tiger available for testing, but Holtz runs the calculations. The Tiger's frontal armor is thicker, 100 millimeters flat plate on the hull, but it's not sloped. The effective thickness is actually less than the Panther's sloped 80mm plate. The teen 90mm gun would penetrate it. They test mobility next. On paper, the Panther should be superior. It has a better power-to-weight ratio, 700 horsepower moving 45 metric tons, versus the Pershing's 500 horsepower moving 46 tons. The Panther should be faster, more agile. On paved roads, the Panther does edge ahead, not by much, perhaps 5 kilometers per hour at top speed, but noticeably faster. Cross-country, something unexpected happens. The Pershing keeps pace. On rough terrain, through mud, over obstacles, the American tank actually performs better than the Panther. The reason becomes clear when they examine the running gear. The Panther uses interleaved road wheels, overlapping wheels that provide excellent weight distribution and a smooth ride. It's an elegant engineering solution, typical of German design philosophy. But those overlapping wheels trap mud. In winter, they freeze solid. Changing an inner road wheel requires removing multiple outer wheels, a process that can take an entire day in field conditions. The Pershing uses a simpler torsion bar suspension with individual road wheels, wider tracks, more ground clearance. Less elegant, but brutally practical. Mud falls off easily. Ice doesn't trap components. Field maintenance is straightforward. One of the test drivers, an Unteroffizier who served on the Eastern Front during the winter of 1943–44, climbs out of the Pershing after a particularly muddy cross-country run. His uniform is splattered with mud, but there's an odd expression on his face. "I could maintain this tank," he says. "In the field, with limited tools, I could keep it running." He glances at the Panther sitting nearby, its interleaved wheels already caking with mud. "I'm not certain I can say the same about ours anymore." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The final tests focus on crew ergonomics and fighting efficiency. It's March 9th now, 3 days of intensive testing. 3 days of accumulated data that all points in the same uncomfortable direction. Inside the Pershing's turret, Holtz notices details that individually seem minor but collectively matter. The turret basket rotates with the turret, keeping the crew in position relative to the gun. In older German tanks, the crew had to shuffle around as the turret rotated, inefficient and exhausting. Pershing has adopted this feature. Modern Panthers have it too, but the American implementation is cleaner. The commander's cupola provides excellent visibility, 7 vision blocks offering panoramic views. The German cupola design on the Panther is good, but not noticeably better. The gun controls are intuitive. The hydraulic traverse makes target tracking smooth and effortless. The gunner doesn't tire during extended engagements. In a Panther, manual traversal becomes exhausting after 30 minutes of continuous operation. The Americans have also thought about the ammunition storage. Rounds are stored low in the hull and protected by additional armor plates. Wet stowage. The Americans surround the ammunition with water jackets that suppress fires. It's a response to the Sherman's tendency to catch fire, but it's an effective solution. German tanks store ammunition along the hull sides, where any penetrating hit can detonate it. On the afternoon of March 9th, Holtz begins writing his preliminary report. He's put it off as long as possible, hoping the data might somehow change and might reveal weaknesses that would restore German superiority. But the data is what it is. Facts don't bend to hope. He writes by hand, carefully choosing words that will communicate the truth without sounding defeatist. The wrong tone might get the report dismissed as pessimism, but the facts must be stated clearly. The American M26 represents a fundamental shift in armored warfare capability. In the areas of firepower, protection, and crew efficiency, It meets or exceeds the performance of the Panther OSF-G. He pauses, considering how to phrase the next part. Firepower. The 90mm M3 gun demonstrates superior armor penetration against all German tank types at combat ranges. The increased projectile mass provides a greater post-penetration effect. At 800 meters, the M26 can reliably penetrate the Panther's frontal armor. The Panther cannot reliably penetrate the M26's frontal armor at the same range. The words look stark on the page. Treasonous, almost. But they're true. Protection. The M26's armor layout, utilizing thick sloped plates and strategic component placement, provides superior crew survivability compared to the Panther. Testing indicates the M26 is effectively immune to frontal penetration by the Panther's main gun at combat ranges. He continues writing, documenting the mobility tests, the ergonomic observations, the maintenance considerations. Each section builds the same picture. The Americans have built a tank that, in most combat scenarios, would defeat the Panther. Not through sophisticated engineering, through practical effectiveness. The Germans designed the Panther to be the perfect tank optimized for maximum performance, featuring advanced metallurgy and complex systems. The Americans designed the Pershing to win fights, good enough armor, good enough gun, simple enough to maintain, effective enough to kill. And good enough turned out to be better. Holtz writes through the evening, filling page after page with technical data, test results, conclusions. Around him, the testing facility is quiet. Most of the crew has returned to their barracks. Only a few guards remain, walking their posts in the darkness. He thinks about all the engagements German tank crews have fought against these Pershings since January. Not many, only 20 or so Pershings reached the front, and they were distributed across multiple divisions. But German intelligence reports document several encounters. Panthers damaged, some were destroyed. The reports attributed it to favorable American tactical positions, to luck, to numerical superiority, not to superior equipment, never to superior equipment, because that was unthinkable. German armor was the best in the world. Everyone knew this. It was a fact, like gravity or mathematics, except it wasn't a fact. It was a belief. And beliefs can be wrong. The full report is completed on March 11th. 23 pages of technical analysis, test data, and conclusions. Holtz signs it, dates it, and forwards it through channels to Wehrmacht High Command. He has no illusions about what it means strategically. The war is lost. Everyone with functioning eyes can see this. The Soviets are approaching Berlin. The Western Allies are driving into the Ruhr. Germany is collapsing. But on a professional level, on the level of technical truth, the report matters. Future German officers, if there is a future German military need to understand what happened, need to understand that technical superiority cannot be assumed, that the enemy can innovate, that belief in one's own invincibility is the first step toward defeat. The irony, Holtz realizes as he seals the report, is that the Americans only built 310 Pershings before the war in Europe ended. Just 310 tanks, a tiny fraction of the tens of thousands of Shermans they produced. If the Pershing had been rushed into production 6 months earlier, if the American bureaucracy had moved faster, if doctrine had been less rigid, how different would the fighting have been? How many Sherman crews would have survived? How many German tank units would have been overwhelmed not just by numbers but by qualitatively superior equipment? The Americans had the capability to build these tanks since late 1943. They chose not to, or rather, their doctrinal disputes and institutional inertia prevented them from doing so, and German tankers benefited from that delay. Every month the Pershing remained in development was another month. German armour supremacy persisted. But that supremacy was an illusion, a temporary advantage that existed only because the opponent hadn't yet deployed their full capability. And now, in March 1945, with the Reich in its death throes, German engineers are discovering what American engineers have known for over a year. The Pershing is a better tank than the Panther. The question nobody wants to ask is, what else have we been wrong about? The report reached Wehrmacht High Command on March 15, 1945. By then, the situation had deteriorated further. American forces are across the Rhine in multiple places. The Soviets have taken most of Silesia. Fuel shortages are so severe that entire Panzer divisions are immobilized, their tanks sitting in forests and villages, waiting for gasoline that will never arrive. In this context, a technical report about captured enemy equipment might seem irrelevant. What does it matter if the American tank is superior when there's no fuel to move German tanks anyway? When will the war be over in weeks? But military institutions don't stop functioning just because the strategic situation is hopeless. Professional officers continue doing their jobs. Technical evaluations continue being written, filed, studied. Perhaps because maintaining these routines is the only way to preserve sanity when everything else is collapsing. The report circulates among armour specialists and tactical planners. Some dismiss it as defeatist pessimism. Others read it carefully, cross-reference it with field reports from the Western Front, and realize that Holtz's conclusions explain several puzzling engagements. A Panther destroyed near Cologne by a single frontal shot at long range attributed in the original report to unknown. Enemy weapon, now understood as a Pershing. A Tiger immobilized and abandoned after taking multiple hits to the frontal armor without penetration, but with the crew evacuating due to shock and fear of internal damage, the Pershing's 90mm gun hitting hard enough to spall armor on the interior without full penetration, exactly as Holtz's testing predicted. An entire Panzer platoon withdrew from a position after sighting new American heavy tanks, previously dismissed as cowardice, now understood as tactical prudence. The report's recommendations are stark and useless. German tank development should immediately shift to larger caliber guns. The 88mm should become standard. Armor layouts should prioritize simplicity and ease of manufacture over maximum protection. Design philosophy should embrace the American approach. Build what works, not what's perfect. It's March 1945. There is no time to implement any of this. The facilities that built Panthers are being overrun or bombed into rubble. The steel that would forge new tanks doesn't exist. The trained crews who would operate them are dead or retreating. But the technical truth remains, and that truth will outlive the Reich. Holtz continues his work through late March and into April. Additional captured American equipment arrives, a Sherman Jumbo with thicker frontal armor, some tank destroyer variants, portions of damaged vehicles. He tests what he can, documents what he finds, writes reports that fewer and fewer people read. On April 16th, Soviet artillery began the bombardment of Berlin. The final battle has begun. Holtz receives orders to evacuate the testing facility and move west toward the American lines rather than east toward the Soviets. Like many Wehrmacht units in the final weeks, they're trying to surrender to the Western Allies rather than face Soviet captivity. The Pershing, the captured tank that revealed so much, is destroyed before evacuation. Thermite grenades in the engine compartment and turret. They can't leave it functional for recapture. The tank burns through the night of April 18th. thick smoke rising into a sky already dark with the smoke of a dying nation. Holtz surrendered to American forces near Regensburg on May 2, 1945, 6 days before the official German surrender. He and his remaining crew are processed as prisoners of war, interrogated, and eventually sorted into detention camps. During his interrogation by American intelligence officers, Holtz mentions the testing program. The Americans are immediately interested. They produce a translator and spend 6 hours questioning him about the Pershing evaluation. What tests were conducted? What were the results? What did German crews think of American armor? Holtz answers honestly. There's no tactical value in deception now. The war is over. And part of him wants the Americans to understand what they built, wants them to know that their tank wasn't just adequate, but genuinely superior. The American intelligence officer, a captain named Holbrook, listens to the translated testimony with an expression that shifts from interest to something like anger. "We only sent 20 Pershings to Europe initially," Holbrook says. 20 tanks, total. And you're telling me if we'd sent 20,000, your Panthers would have been obsolete? Not obsolete, Holtz corrects through the translator, but at a severe disadvantage in frontal engagements. Yes. Why didn't we send more? Holtz has no answer to that. He doesn't understand American military politics or industrial decisions, but he can see the frustration in Holbrook's face, the realization that American tankers died in Shermans while superior tanks sat in depots or weren't built at all. The war ended for Germany on May 8, 1945. Holtz spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp in France before being repatriated to what was now West Germany in 1947. He returned to a country that no longer existed. The Reich was gone, divided between occupying powers, its military dissolved, its industrial capacity being stripped for reparations. He found work as a technical translator, his engineering background and knowledge of English making him valuable in the reconstruction effort. He didn't serve in the new Bundeswehr when it was formed in the 1950s. He was too old. And his wartime rank created complications in denazification proceedings. But he followed the development of post-war armoured vehicles with professional interest. The Americans continued the Pershing line, the M26 Patton, the M47, eventually the M48 and M60. Each generation refined the basic philosophy: practical effectiveness over technical perfection, good enough armor, powerful enough gun, simple enough maintenance, reliable enough operation. The German tank development, when West Germany was allowed to rebuild its military, took a different path. The Leopard 1, introduced in 1965, embraced mobility and firepower over heavy armor, learning the lesson that armor thick enough to stop modern guns made tanks too heavy to be practical. But the fundamental American insight that practical effectiveness beats theoretical perfection became doctrine across NATO militaries. In 1982, at age 68, Holtz was interviewed by a German military historian researching late-war equipment evaluations. The historian had found Holtz's original report in American archives, captured German documents that had been classified for decades and recently declassified. "Reading your report now," the historian said, "knowing what we know about the Pershing's performance in Korea and its influence on post-war design, it's remarkably prescient. You identified the fundamental shift in tank warfare philosophy." Holtz shook his head. "I identified what was already obvious if you were willing to see it. The Americans understood something we didn't, or something we understood but couldn't accept. Which was that wars aren't won by building perfect weapons. They're won by building adequate weapons and having enough of them soon enough. The Pershing wasn't a perfect tank, but it was good enough to win, and they could build it in quantities we couldn't match. That combination, effectiveness and availability, that's what we failed to grasp. The historian asked about the psychological impact of testing the Pershing. What did it feel like to discover German armor supremacy was ending? Holtz was quiet for a long time before answering. We built our confidence on technical superiority. When you're outnumbered 5-1, when your logistics are failing, when your army is retreating, you need something to believe in. We believed in our equipment. The Panther was the best tank in the world. The Tiger was invincible. These weren't just technical facts, they were psychological anchors. Testing that Pershing removed the anchor. It forced us to confront the possibility that we'd been lying to ourselves, that our tanks weren't invincible, that the enemy had caught up and perhaps surpassed us. In March 1945, that realization didn't change anything strategically. The war was already lost, but psychologically it was devastating. The last pillar of pride, technical excellence, was crumbling. He paused, looking out the window of his small apartment in Frankfurt. The Americans beat us with production capacity and resources. Everyone acknowledges that. But they also beat us with better design philosophy. They didn't try to build the perfect tank. They built a practical tank, and practical beats are perfect. That's the lesson we should have learned in 1943 but didn't accept until 1945. By then, it was far too late. The historian published the interview in a journal article about late-war German equipment evaluations. It received little attention outside specialist circles, but it preserved Holtz's perspective, a perspective that explained not just what happened, but why it mattered. The captured Pershing that Holtz tested was destroyed in April 1945, but its influence extended far beyond that single tank. The report it generated, the tactical insights it provided, the psychological impact of its existence, these rippled through the final weeks of the war and into post-war military thinking. American forces that encountered German armor in April and early May 1945 faced opponents who had lost confidence in their technical superiority. German crews who knew about the Pershing and word spread quickly in tank units fought more cautiously, withdrew more readily, and took fewer risks. The mystique of German armor invincibility had already been eroded by Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front. The Pershing completed that erosion on the Western Front. For American tankers, the Pershing's existence, even in tiny numbers, provided a psychological counter to the Panthers' reputation. They weren't helpless. They had equipment that could fight on equal terms. The few units that operated Pershings reported morale improvements that extended beyond just the Pershing crews. Knowing that American industry could build tanks that matched German armor made the entire armored force feel less outclassed. But the deepest irony remained the numbers. Only 310 Pershings were produced before VE Day. Production continued after the European war ended, preparing for the invasion of Japan. The M26 eventually served in Korea, where it proved highly effective against North Korean T-34 tanks. But in Europe, in the battles where it was needed most, it barely appeared. Hundreds of Sherman crews died in engagements where a Pershing would have survived. Thousands of infantrymen were killed or wounded because supporting Sherman tanks couldn't suppress German armor effectively. The capability existed since late 1943. The production capacity existed. What didn't exist was institutional willingness to acknowledge that American armor doctrine was wrong. General McNair, who insisted tanks shouldn't fight tanks, was killed in Normandy by American bombs during Operation Cobra. His death didn't change doctrine quickly enough. By the time the Pershing reached Europe in meaningful numbers, meaning not meaningful numbers at all, really, the war was nearly over. This is perhaps the most bitter part of Holtz's discovery. The Germans feared facing the Pershing. They were right to fear it, but they faced it so rarely that the fear was almost abstract. Like fearing lightning strikes, dangerous when it happens, but unlikely enough that you don't change your behavior. If the Americans had deployed Pershings in the autumn of 1944, during the fighting around Aachen and in the Outgunned forest, German armoured tactics would have required fundamental revision. The Panthers' advantage would have evaporated. Crew losses would have mounted catastrophically. The Ardennes offensive in December, Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge, might have faltered even faster if American defenders had been equipped with Pershings instead of Shermans and inadequate tank destroyers. But history is written with what happened, not what might have been. What happened is that German tankers maintained their technical confidence through most of the war. They fought knowing their equipment was superior. That confidence sustained them through impossible odds and hopeless situations. And in March 1945, in a testing facility in Bavaria, that confidence was scientifically disproven. The Americans had built something better, not through sophisticated over-engineering, but through practical effectiveness. Werner Holtz died in 1994 at age 80. He lived long enough to see the Cold War end, to see German reunification, to see the Soviet Union collapse. The great ideological and military contest that dominated his adult life concluded not with the dramatic tank battles he'd tested for, but with political transformation and economic exhaustion. In his final years, he occasionally spoke at military academies and technical schools about his experiences. His message was consistent. Don't assume superiority. Don't dismiss enemy capabilities. Don't let pride blind you to reality. We thought we were the best, he would say. And for a time, we were. But being the best in 1942 doesn't mean staying the best in 1945. The enemy adapted, they learned, they built better equipment, and we didn't notice until it was too late to matter. He kept a copy of his March 1945 report in his personal papers. The original, he knew, was in American archives, but he'd made a carbon copy at the time, and he'd kept it through surrender, imprisonment, repatriation, and decades of civilian life. Sometimes he would take it out and read through the technical specifications, the test results, the careful conclusions, evidence of a truth that arrived too late to change anything strategically, but early enough to destroy comfortable illusions. The Pershing wasn't a war-winning weapon. No single tank design could have been. Wars are won through combinations of strategy, logistics, industrial capacity, manpower, and political will. Equipment matters, but it's never decisive alone. But the Pershing was a symbol. It represented the moment when American armoured capability caught up with and surpassed German capability. It marked the transition from quantitative superiority, more tanks, but worse tanks, to qualitative equality, or advantage. And it served as a lesson about the dangers of believing your own propaganda. German armour was the best in the world, until it wasn't. And the transition from best to second best happened gradually, invisibly, while German crews continued believing the old truth. By the time Holtz proved the new truth in his testing report, the war was lost. Knowledge without time to act is just academic curiosity. The information couldn't save the Reich or change the war's outcome, but it could correct the historical record. It could explain to future generations how armoured warfare evolved in the final years of World War II. It could demonstrate that technical excellence isn't permanent. It must be maintained, updated, adapted to changing circumstances. The Panther was an exceptional tank in 1943. By 1945, it was obsolescent, not because it got worse, but because the opposition got better. That's the lesson of the captured Pershing. That's what Holtz's report documented. That's what German tankers learned too late to use. The enemy adapts, the enemy learns, the enemy builds better weapons. And if you assume your superiority is permanent, you'll discover your blatant mistake only when the evidence becomes undeniable. For German armor crews, that evidence was American 90mm shells punching through Panther armor at ranges where the Panther couldn't reply effectively. For Hauptmann Werner Holtz, that evidence was a clipboard full of test data that shattered illusions. For history, that evidence is a reminder that wars are won not by those who start with the best equipment, but by those who end with it. The Americans ended World War II with the Pershing, not in decisive numbers, not soon enough to save thousands of Sherman crews, but soon enough to demonstrate what practical engineering and industrial might could accomplish when finally directed toward the right goal. The Germans ended World War II with the knowledge that their vaunted armor superiority had been surpassed, not by a miracle weapon or exotic technology, by simple American pragmatism, a bigger gun, thicker armor, and simpler maintenance. Good enough proved better than perfect. That realization came in March 1945 in a Bavarian testing facility, in the mind of an officer who understood what he was seeing but couldn't change what it meant. The war was ending, the truth was emerging, and the two arrived simultaneously, too late to alter the outcome, but just in time to record what actually happened. German armor supremacy ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with a test report that nobody had time to read properly before surrender. That's how empires fall. Not always with drama, but sometimes with data. Not with thunder, but with the quiet scratch of a pen documenting an uncomfortable truth. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.